Good afternoon, everyone. It's our pleasure to welcome you to the VA Boston First Friday Faculty Development Presentations. Very excited for our speaker today, Rebecca Meinhardt. She is an assistant professor of anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and she's going to be talking to us about encouraging speaking up, evidence-based strategies for enhancing communication. And Rebecca, I know you've done a little bit of research in this area as well, correct?
Yes, that's right. I actually have had I've had the good fortune to have some grant-funded research for both speaking up work and also feedback-related work. And so my great interest in this area has been, sort of supported in that way. I also am a simulation instructor for the Center for Medical Simulation, so I use these techniques in those sometimes stressful simulation settings where we're all working together to give the patient best care. And I'm also a core member of the MGH Learning Laboratory Simulation Officers Group, where I help to coordinate the interprofessional simulations with the operating room teams. So, yes. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you all today. I'm so honored to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic. I'm really passionate about this topic because I really believe that if we can help people speak up, share their ideas, their concerns, their thoughts, that we can all help to bring our best selves to the workplace to not only increase and enhance patient safety, but also to bring more joy into the workplace as well. So I'm going to be talking to you about speaking up today. And just by way of disclosure, I've got no relevant financial disclosures to this talk. I am on the medical advisory board of a device company, but I'm not going to mention that further during this talk. So I'd like to start off with a story, which is really how I got interested in this body of research. And that dates back to about a dozen years ago. I was a newly minted obstetric anesthesia fellow coming from the Midwest, and I had been at a really wonderful anesthesia residency program in the Midwest, but I was coming into the Harvard system, and for me, I was incredibly intimidated. I was really, really excited, very dedicated to spend the next year, helping my maternal patients, their newborns, but also just unbelievably intimidated. And so when I came to the Harvard system, I was approached by one of my attendings, one of my mentors. She's at MGH, her name is May P.N. Smith, and she asked me if I wanted to be part of a study where I would help them to understand how people performed under crises, during obstetric crises. And so, she explained it that we would go to the simulation center, I would partake in some of these situations, they would be simulations that I would do, and then we would come back and we'd talk about it. I'd get some feedback on my performance. And so that sounded great to me. I thought that is exactly what I want to do to help learn how to keep moms and their babies safe. So I went to the simulation center, and sure enough, it was a whole simulated operating room. I went there. I had a simulated attending anesthesiologist. There was an obstetrician. There was a nurse. And we went and took care of a patient who was having a crisis. And I felt like during the case, I was actually responding very quickly. I was doing everything that was asked, and I was, I thought, doing a great job. So as we walked back to the debriefing room where we were going to talk about things, I was feeling pretty good. I felt like I was going to get some really good feedback, just a little tweaks here and there. And that's when I found out it was a study about speaking up. And so when they played the video, I watched myself basically in horror as the simulated anesthesia attending would ask me to do something, and I would pause, blink, and then do whatever it was that he said. And the things that he was asking me to do were not necessarily in the best interest of the patient and certainly deserved conversation. And so when I saw this, I was pretty disgusted at myself. I was pretty upset. I thought this is not the way that I would give my best to my patients by discounting everything that was in my head. Because I remember what I was thinking at the time when he asked me what to do. I would stop and I would think, that doesn't quite sound right, but this guy's from Harvard. He must really know what he's talking about. I need to go hit the books some more when I get home. And so in this artificial situation where the actor was not even an anesthesiologist, I still subverted my own thoughts and all of my intuition and everything, my experience, in favor of this hierarchy that I had created in my mind. And so I took all those negative emotions and I decided that I would try to put them to good use and try to help understand more about why people don't speak up, what gets in their way and how to help them, because I figured if they're doing a study about it, it must be more than just me who has trouble with this. So that's what brings me to this day. So through this talk, I'd like to sort of go through these types of learning objectives with you to help define what speaking up is, because I described a situation about speaking up, but I want to really dig into it a little further. And we can talk about this in patient safety context, leadership, education, any kind of context. The best thing about studying this is that it sort of applies to all areas of life. We're going to talk about reasons why people stay silent. And I'm also going to then move into some conversational strategies that can help with challenging communication, because I think that's really where we need to practice. And it's hard because we're going to talk about it, but really it's up to people to practice it in order to make it happen. So I'm going to take a little pause here and just have you consider what speaking up is. In other contexts, people might ask, well, what is speaking up and how does it differ from just speaking? So I want you to think about that just for a second. And I'll share with you some of the literature's point of view with what defines speaking up and how is it different. So the first thing is that usually people say that it's upward directed. There's some sort of a hierarchical gradient that that your voice is speaking against or toward. It can be within or across teams, so it could be within a team. It could be nurses speaking up to nurses. It could be surgeons speaking up to surgeons. It doesn't have to be across teams all the time. And why do people speak up? It's to challenge the status quo, to change the direction of where things are going. And why? It's to avoid problems, to avoid errors, to save the patient, to save the situation. But all of this comes at some kind of interpersonal risk. So there's always a risk calculation that somebody is making in the moment to decide whether or not it's worth it to stick my neck out. So this is what the definition is of speaking up. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of these elements a little later. So you say, well, how often does it happen? How often do people not speak up to those of higher status? And I'll say that I've given this talk dozens of times across all kinds of different audiences, including international audiences with senior surgeons, administrators, senior nurses, all kinds of people. And I would say when I ask this of my audiences, about 90% of people say that they've had trouble speaking up, and 10% say that they don't have trouble speaking up. So I ask you the same question. I ask you to consider that. And in fact, if you think you're one of the people if you consider yourself that you don't have a problem speaking up, think about the other 90% of people around you who may have trouble. So this, I think, still applies to everyone. In the literature, there's a study done in Vital Smarts where they surveyed nurses and physicians, hundreds of nurses and physicians, and in different situations, anywhere from 84 to 99% of the physicians and nurses said that it was hard or near impossible to speak up. And the situations with which they were presented were things like if your colleague is disruptive to the team, does not promote teamwork, or if your colleague is impaired. And so these are things that we know are real patient safety threats. And still almost 100% of people found it really, really difficult to speak up. And just to, again, point out how pervasive this issue is, this was a study done in 2015 where nurses, 48 nurses, of all kinds of experience levels, from a few months out of training to 30-plus years of training, average is about 10 years of training, or 10 years of practice, excuse me. They were randomized to a simulated setting where they had to take care of a patient prior to surgery, and they had to have a conversation with a virtual surgeon, which was just a computer drawing projected on a screen, and a virtual anesthesiologist was part of their team, or a human surgeon and a virtual anesthesiologist. So these nurses were randomized into two groups. The surgeon was suggesting doing something dangerous in the eyes of the nurse who had additional information. It wasn't because the surgeon was a bad person, it's just that the surgeon didn't have all of the information. And what was really striking to me was only 20% of nurses in each group talking to even a computer-generated drawing of a surgeon. Only 20% stopped the line. And we looked at the people who said they didn't have any issue with the situation and really sort of suppressed all of their concerns, about anywhere from 41 to 49%, with both the human surgeon and the drawing of the surgeon said that they were okay with whatever the surgeon said. So this just shows what a problem we have, where people were really even so silent in the face of a drawing. And so why do people stay silent? So this This draws from literature that comes from business, from the airline industry, from nuclear power, space program, and healthcare. And it really distills down to it's a people problem. It's not a healthcare issue in particular. It is a problem with us, but it's also extrapolated to other fields as well. And so a lot of times people cite many different reasons, but these are just some of the few that I hope are more relevant to you. So with our need for medical certainty and our need for sure answers, a lot of people don't speak up because they're afraid that they'll look like they don't know what they're talking about, that they don't have the right information, and certainly that was true for me when I was a fellow. A lot of people do fear retribution, so they fear that their professional life will come to some harm if they speak up. And then others are really afraid of relationships, harming relationships that have already been formed and are maybe a little shaky to begin with, or harming relationships before they form, because we know that relational conflict in our workplaces and in our teams is a really big detriment to patient care. And so these are some reasons. I hope that some of these resonate with you as far as if you recall back to reasons why you may not have spoken up. And so I do want to address the concept that speaking up doesn't necessarily have to be towards or speaking up to a hierarchy that's real. It could be a perceived hierarchy. So what do I mean by that? So for example, if I imagine that I'm going to speak up to another member of my department, say my department chair, other people from the outside will recognize that my department chair has a higher professional standing than I do. But say I have a colleague who's at my same level of training, has been in the system the same number of years, but maybe I in my head think they have a better defined skill set than I do. They have more advanced skills in a certain area. If I want to speak up to them, I may actually think of them as my senior, and so therefore I'm creating a hierarchy there when other people might not see that or appreciate that. Similarly, in social standing, if some people have higher influence in a social standing, then somebody who is of a higher hierarchical status in a professional level may be intimidated to speak up to somebody who could potentially use their social contacts to cause problems for the person speaking up. So this is a study by Nadine Bienfeld and Groth, who surveyed cockpit crews. They surveyed thousands of people in these cockpit crews, and the cockpit crews consisted of captains, who we typically think of as the pilots, and then first officers, who we typically think of as co-pilots, and then the flight attendants, who take care of the cabin crew, or the passengers, and then somebody called a purser, who is a person who is the go-between between the flight attendants and the captain. They report directly to the captain. And so in the order of hierarchy, they're considered to be the captains at the top, and then the pursers, the first officers, and then the flight attendants. So Groth and Bienfeld asked all of these people, when they don't speak up, what gets in their way, what's the main reason? And they found some pretty surprising evidence that for the first officers, pursers, and flight attendants, so everybody below the captain, they really feared punishment. They feared that the hammer would come down, that they would get professional problems later on because the captain would be unhappy, would report to their supervisors, and et cetera. For the lowest rungs of the hierarchical ladder, the first officers and the flight attendants really felt like their speaking up efforts were totally futile. That they would say something, nothing would happen, so why would they say anything again? Because nothing ever happens. And then finally, at the top of the hierarchical ladder, you would think the captains overwhelmingly reported that they were fearful of damaging relationships. They knew that speaking up to the flight attendants, they needed their support, they needed their trust, and the flight attendants were much more friendly with each other than they were with the captain. And so if the captain spoke up to a flight attendant, then maybe that social support that the flight attendant had could go back and harm the captain somehow. He couldn't get the respect or the trust of the crew. And so that was really interesting. So it doesn't have to be that you have a professional standing that's higher in order for somebody to think that it's hard to speak up to you. It could be these other relationships as well. So now I've talked a little bit about some of these challenges, but then how do we overcome these hurdles to speaking up? Because ultimately, we really need to get past that in order to allow people to feel safe and secure to share their thoughts, to share their concerns, to share their ideas for best patient care. And so essentially, we did a study of attending anesthesiologists, and we asked them all what would help them speak up. It was part of a larger study that we published in Academic Medicine just recently. And what they said was, of the top 5 things that would help, two things stood out. So first was having a language for speaking up. Have a language for speaking up. So what words to say? So people didn't even know what to say or how to say it. So they said, if you gave me some script to follow, that not only I would understand as speaking up, but other people would catch on and they would recognize the language as I'm trying to speak up and help me out there, then that would be really helpful. And the other thing that was really important is that they had a second opinion. They had a buddy to say, yes, I think you need to say something, you need to stop, they had to have some moral support sort of from another person. And so these two things were what we had combined into our educational interventions and what we've applied to different situations as well. So what we've taught and what we've studied in not only teaching residents how to speak up to their attendings, but also how to teach faculty how to give feedback to their residents in other situations, we've used some of these similar conversational strategies. So I'm going to describe them now. So specifically for speaking up, we look to aviation, and from the aviation industry comes the two challenge rule. So what that says is that if the captain and first officer are flying a plane together, and the first officer sees something that doesn't look safe, so say the first officer believes that they're flying too low and won't clear the terrain later on, then the first officer is mandated to speak up to the pilot, first from a stance of curiosity. So saying something like, so Captain, I see that our altitude is quite low compared to what I'm comfortable with. I'm worried we won't clear the terrain up ahead. What are you thinking? Why are we on this path? If the first officer gets no response or a nonsense response, then the first officer is mandated to speak again from a stance of stronger concern. So, Captain, I'm really concerned we're going to crash because we're so low and I'm not seeing that we're going to clear the terrain ahead. Can you tell me what is going on for you? Why are we doing this? If the first officer has a no response or nonsense response again from the captain, then the first officer is mandated to take over the controls of the plane. Fly the plane to safety as defined by the first officer. So as we try to transport this model into healthcare, it doesn't quite fit, because for me as an anesthesiologist, if I'm in an operating room and I don't agree with something the surgeon's doing, I am not going to leap over the drapes and try to take the laparoscopic instruments away. That doesn't work because we don't have overlapping skill sets in that way. So what we say instead is that we do the two challenge. We first ask from a curious standpoint and then escalate our concerns the second time. But if we are unsuccessful both times, we call for another person. We call for somebody who's maybe a trusted person by both parties, and they can help mediate the situation. But clearly, a conversation needs to happen, and it's not happening right now. So that's how we get around the taking over the controls of the plane. We say invite other people. Often they're more senior of the hierarchical level than the people who are involved. And so I have in here curiosity and respect. Curiosity and respect I'll talk about a little bit more later. They're really the way to start to get the conversation going so that people aren't reacting to emotions, but instead they're able to get past that and actually share their thoughts, especially the person who's being spoken up to, and we'll cover that a lot later. But in this challenge, so what do we say when we challenge? Well, we have this framework that we use. It's called advocacy inquiry, and it's pairing a statement of your observation with what you think and then inviting the other person to share. So it's a very effective and very efficient way to speak, especially when the stakes are high and time is short. And so I'm going to go through it next in the next slide. So advocacy inquiry, the title of this is sort of, they're just considered, it comes from speech acts, so it's how people talk, it's the building blocks of speech. But what I like to think of it is basically having people share and then having people ask for more information, because that's really what you want. You really want a conversation. So I should say that the goal here is not to make somebody else do what you want, and it's not to make you do what somebody else wants. It's to have a new understanding of the situation. So either you're going by your way, by their way, or some new way. So it's really about having the conversation. Okay, so I just want to make that clear. So what advocacy inquiry says is basically that you start with your data, your observations, and you start with just that level, and you share them with the other person so that they can get situated to what it is that you're looking at. And then you go to what your concerns are so that they can follow your line of thinking and they can understand where you're coming from. And then you ask just an open-ended question. It's not, don't you think that's dangerous? It's, how do you see things? So it's very different. It's not, you do it my way. It's, how are you seeing this that I'm not seeing it? And then the next step, step 3, is super critical. It's listening to the other person. So a lot of us have a really hard time listening to other people, especially when our emotions are high, when we're concerned about something. That's going on in our brains, and we're often sometimes thinking about the next thing we're going to say, the next piece of data that we're going to share to say we can't do this anymore, instead of clearing our heads and actually focusing on the other person to hear what they have to say, because that's where the money is. That's where the important part is. And then you can have a discussion to figure out what is the best course of action. Not just do it my way or do it your way. What is the best course of action? So that's what advocacy inquiry is. And we taught people this. We taught people, we use it for speaking up, again, like I said, for residents, for attendings. We use it for feedback. And there's all kinds of different situations in which this is very efficient, effective language to get inside the other person's head very quickly. So I just want to say that that's the verbal stuff, right? That's the stuff that we say. And as it turns out, only about 20% of our interhuman communication is verbal. So the words that I'm saying here, what a brilliant idea, glad you're on this team. If I pair it with a nonverbal message like this is a very different message. This completely changes the message. So 80% of our communication between people is actually through our nonverbals. Even when it's concealed, when we're gowned and gloved and have masks on and hats and everything like that, I can tell when another person is staring at me versus just glancing. It's we develop these systems, they're hyper-developed in us. So we have to be careful about these type of nonverbal communications. If we see something that's unsafe, that as deemed by us, we have to be careful how we're going to the other person and saying, hey, what are you doing? So we don't want to be looking like this, or this, or this, what are you doing? Because this, if the other person sees this, the person we're trying to speak up to sees this, they're going to, in their reptilian brain, they're going to have a huge surge of catechols, they're going to have a huge emotional reaction, and they're only going to be reacting to our emotions instead of what we're asking them to say. And so this will shut down a conversation quicker than anything. So we have to be very careful about our nonverbal communication. So instead, we have to somehow get ourselves to being curious, respectful, supportive of another person. And I really like this quote because I think when I read it, it just really drove home to me. Respect is like air. You don't really notice it until it's not there, and then it's all you notice. And I think this is very, very true for all of us. A fundamental human need is to be respected. And when we don't show respect to other people, we activate that reptilian brain and we shut down conversations. And so the picture to the right shows this little girl who's really concerned, maybe standing up to her friend who's about to do something, speaking up to her, using I saw, I think, I wonder, but doing so in a way that she's really invested in her. She's caring, she's curious, she's supportive. And so we need to get ourselves there. So there's a lot of reasons why we might have nonverbal communication displaying that doesn't necessarily help us. And so there's been a lot of literature on this. But I really like this sort of more lay person approach to all the body of literature, which comes from Crucial. They say that sort of in the most simplistic terms, when we see and hear things, our brain tells ourselves a story, we feel a certain way, and then we act on that. And if we never analyze any of these steps, we will automatically do this every single time. We will never be deliberate or intentional in what we do. We will just always have this unexamined path that leads us to actions, and it might not be the safest thing for our patients and for ourselves. And so what they say is you really have to backtrack and think at each step, where is this getting me, and is it getting me into the place that I need to be? And so what I'd like to start with is the telling ourselves a story part, because I think that's a really interesting and critical thing that we don't often examine. So this is a schematic representation of the ladder of inference. It's something that Chris Argyris, who's a business theorist from the Harvard Business School, created, and he said, this is the way humans see and make meaning of the world. And so basically what is happening is our brains are being bombarded with data streams everywhere. We don't have we don't have the capacity to analyze every data stream available. So our brain selectively chooses to pay attention to certain data. It's based on our preferences, our training, our backgrounds, all those kinds of things. So it's all happening beyond our, sort of conscious thought. And then we start to make assumptions about things. We draw conclusions. We start to believe things about the world around us, and we start to take action because we're believing in a path forward. And so this is great for when you're talking about the physical world. So I have 2 bad shoulders. I've had surgery on both my shoulders. And so if I walk into my office and I see a round object, that's about the size of a watermelon on my desk, and it has 3 holes drilled in it, and it looks like kind of marbly surface, I might think that's a bowling ball. I shouldn't pick it up with my bad shoulder because I might injure it. I need to get somebody else in here to help me get this out. So that's a really helpful running up this ladder of inference that has helped me. The problem becomes when I start to believe things about other people based on their actions, because humans are so much more complicated and their intentions are invisible to us. And so we can't just assume things based on what we see. So for example, if I were to see a colleague about to give a medicine that is contraindicated in a patient, and I believe, I believe the medicine is contraindicated in the patient, and I believe the patient will come to harm, you can imagine what my nonverbal displays would be if the story that I told myself was, oh my gosh, she doesn't care about the patient ever. She is so unsafe. She never looks, I got to stop her from killing somebody. Okay, so say that's the story I tell myself. Versus if I saw the same thing happening, but the story I told myself was, oh my gosh, she cares so much about her patients, she would never want anything bad to happen. I have to get in there to help her out and help her not make this mistake, this honest mistake. So you can imagine when I go in to say, stop, let me, and then do my advocacy inquiry, you can imagine if I'm feeling story number 1, she's going to start reacting to my emotional display because she knows that I'm thinking, you don't care, you're going to kill the patient. And that's very different. Because that might be so far from the truth in her mind. So we have to be very careful what stories we're telling ourselves, because our assumptions can get us really into trouble. So as you can see, there are 2 characters in this story. There's the person who parked the car right over the yellow line, and then there's a person who took the chalk and drew lines around the car and said, parking spot just for you. So the thing that I want to say is, you look at the person who has the chalk and you think, I can see that they might have assumed a couple of things about the person who parked the car. That the person who parked the car, the rules don't apply to them. They feel very entitled. They can just do anything that they want to do. That may or may not be true. We don't really know, though, why that person parked the car right there. I mean, being from Boston, we had that terrible winter where there were mountains of snow, and you sort of, shimmied your car in somewhere, and then the snow melted, and this is what the picture looked like after the snow all melted. Sometimes I have myself been in situations where there's no parking, everybody's parked off kilter, and I squeeze my car in, and then everybody else leaves, and this is what I look like. So, you don't know why the other person did that. The intentions are invisible to us. And say that the person who was wielding the chalk got caught by the person who was driving the car, and, then you have a big conflict going on. So we have to be careful about these assumptions. So I'm going to go through a quick quiz, and I know you can't directly answer me, but I do want you to consider in your heads, because I think now that I've given you some sense of what we're talking about, what is data, what can we know, and what do we assume on top of it, I want to just give you a chance to test your skills at that. So these are just a series of 3 quick questions. So the first is, so I want to know, is this fact or opinion? That person hardly treats me with respect. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to think about that. And so a lot of people are probably saying, well, that's an opinion. And if you said this, that would be correct. So facts would be the behavior. So say the person, I see a person who's with me, and every time I'm talking to them, they just interrupt me to make a call on their phone, or they get up and use the restroom. And so I'm thinking, that is so disrespectful to me. But they're thinking, gosh, I feel so comfortable with this person, just like family. I can just make a phone call in the middle or use the restroom if I need to, and it's all good. So you never know what is in somebody else's head. The second one, you were 30 minutes late today. Is that a fact or is that an opinion? So So I think probably more people would say fact, but I would say actually it's from the perspective. So more often than not, two people had thought that they had agreed on something, but there was been some miscommunication. And so say I thought that I had told you to meet at 7:30, but you remember me saying 8, and I could think that you're half an hour late, but you could think you're right on time. And so there could be different perspectives that lead to a misunderstanding. And so whether it's fact is up for discussion. And the third, she constantly procrastinates with work. So again, the word procrastinate is really implying intent, and that's invisible. Only if she said, boy, I constantly procrastinate with work, could you say that that's a fact, right? Because that's her telling you exactly what the statement is. So again, I can't say enough. There are so many reasons why people do things. This is from a jokey check pad, reasons why I need to apologize to you. And you can see there are all kinds of things. I was feeling insecure. I hate you. I'm in love with you. I was planning a surprise for you. I was hungry. You can't know what somebody is thinking. And a lot of times in the clinical realm, we're used to making very short differential diagnoses in our heads because that's what we do for medicine or for surgery or for anesthesia or any kind of nursing, clinical care, social work, all of these different areas, administrative work. But the problem is when we try to import that way of thinking to understanding where other people are coming from, that's what gets us into trouble. We can't just assume it's one of the top 4 in our differential. And so again, thinking about behaviors, the observable things to us, is just the tip of the iceberg. And what's underneath is something that I'm going to call frames. So frames is a nice word from the sort of the organizational behavior literature and the cognitive literature, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more in the next slide. But that's really what we need to get at to understand where other people are coming from. So a simplistic way to think about frames might be a point of view, somebody's point of view, but it's really more complete than that. It comes from, it's all of their experiences and their background and all of their decisions to that point is causing them to see things in a certain light. So their frame may look very different from your frame. And your judgment of what they're doing comes from your frame, but their behavior comes from their frame. So it's a little bit like what you're seeing is not just fact, it's coming from their point of view, and it's only your point of view. And so really to understand where they're coming from, we need to explore their frames and their understanding and realize there's something very deep and nuanced about the way they're doing things. And so all of this distinguishing fact from opinion can be kind of difficult, and so people sometimes are drawn and moved by emotion much more than rational thought, but thinking about how we overlay our emotions or our thoughts or other assumptions on top of things is really an important skill. And so what I would what I would challenge you to do, I guess, is to just take one assumption that you make during the day, usually about somebody's behavior, and ask yourself sort of, is this the only story I could tell myself about what I'm seeing in front of me? Because by challenging our assumptions and checking them, we can start to be more deliberate about what stories we tell ourselves. And that leads us to the next part, which is perspective taking. So how do we do this on a routine basis, and what is the evidence behind it? So perspective taking is this type of skill that you do. It takes a lot of work to do, but it's a cognitive skill that you do where you try to imagine how the world looks from somebody else's shoes, from somebody else's point of view at that moment. So it's not how would you feel if you were in their shoes, which just reinforces your own view of things, but how must they feel from their point of view. And so this is a technique that people use, and it's just asking yourself that question, how must things look from their point of view? And it has been studied in many different contexts. And so the benefits are numerous. So the first thing is that narcissism is rising as a trait in our society since 1960s. And so, what this does is it can help combat narcissism. And it not only combats narcissistic traits, but hardened criminals who can't feel empathy. When they're given this task to do, to imagine how the other person must feel from their shoes, they actually exhibit sympathetic nervous system activation that shows that they're starting to have some empathetic response to somebody. So even in those people who diagnosed with narcissism personality disorder, they can gain skills using this trait, using this skill. It helps increased curiosity. So curious people, other people want to be around them more. They have happier lives. There's all kinds of benefits to being curious. And it helps in that moment when you're trying to see, when you're seeing something that you really disagree with, you're having a reaction to, you want to jump in. So it helps you if you start to cultivate this, how must they be seeing things that leads them down to make this decision. It helps you be more curious about that. And it helps with your nonverbal communication too and how you're telling yourself your story. And then finally, it boosts creativity. So we all need more creativity in the workplace. Our patients' problems are so complex. Our society is so complex. So we need more creativity overall. Perspective taking also decreases aggression. It does all kinds of pro-social things. And so just engaging in a little bit of perspective taking each day can really help you get yourself to a place where you can start to reap these benefits yourself. So I talked about assumptions and what kind of stories we tell ourselves, and I give you this as a potential story to tell yourself of other people. And this is something that we use all the time in simulation. So, I teach 21 faculty courses a year where I invite anesthesiologists, practicing anesthesiologists, to come together and to practice with an audience of themselves, with an audience of their peers, in high-stakes crisis situations, all for their learning. So not for evaluation, but for learning. And so that's a really hard situation to come into. And so we state this out loud every time we do a simulation, which is that we believe you are intelligent, capable, you care about doing your best, and you want to improve. And so if we can start assuming this of other people, that even if they do things that don't make sense to us and we really feel like are dangerous, that we can sit there and we can say, but they care about doing their best. I know they do. They want to improve. They want to come and they want to take good care of patients. If we can start to tell ourselves this story about people, then that can really help all these conversations going forward. So another technique that I have used, and this is sort of not well studied, but at least this sort of the 3 R's is not well studied, but creating mutual purpose is well studied. This technique I think can be helpful when I'm thinking about speaking up, but I'm feeling a little bit like, oh, is it worth the risk and that kind of thing. And so the 3 things, this comes from Holly Weeks, who's a conversational consultant from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And what she says is that in order to really help you engage in difficult conversations, which speaking up could be considered one, you need to go through these 3 R's. So first I start with, I have respect for myself. So I have respect for myself. I have a view. I have every right to share that view. Why not? And that helps me to sort of feel a little bit more empowered if I'm feeling a little bit less empowered at the time. Respect for the other person. So instead of the other person being an enemy, they have every right to have their point of view, and I just need to find out what it is. So that makes them a little less, the emotional baggage that comes with feeling like somebody is doing something wrong sort of dissipates just a little bit. And then respect for the problem. It's not me being a troublemaker. We have a problem, and it's separate from me. And so the patient needs to have help, and if the team doesn't get together and is on the same page, then that's a problem for everybody. So it sort of separates you from the problem. And then creating mutual purpose is really key. So focusing on the patient, focusing on the team, something like that, can really help people overcome some of these problems with speaking up. And that has been studied in one study down here, a survey study by Kobayashi et al. So those can be helpful. I can't underscore the importance of listening. I can't say it enough. So we have so many reasons for not listening well. Our brains work really fast. Human speech is not that fast, and our brains fill in the gaps a lot of times. So you might notice that your mind wanders when you're trying to listen to somebody, especially if they're speaking slowly. Sometimes people are crowding out what they're, like I said before, people are imagining what they're going to say. They're anticipating what they're going to say instead of listening to the other person. But that gets us into all kinds of trouble. So if we can just sort of put that all on hold and focus on somebody else, then we gain a lot of benefits from that. So first, we gain trust from other people. They trust us more if they feel like they're listening to us, if we're listening to them. Alliances form where you didn't think you had alliances. You come up with better solutions because that's what we need here. And you get some useful information too. So all of these things are very important, and I think we need to, again, instead of thinking, I'm going to speak up and I'm going to make you do what I think we should do, think of it as, I'm going to speak up because I really need to know what's going on in your head so we can come together. That is the message of this talk. I hope if you take nothing else away, that's what I want you to take away. So for the 10% who say that maybe they don't have as much trouble speaking up, what you do really, really matters. So leaders, and you're all leaders in some fashion, can really either enable or inhibit speaking up by what they do. And there's a lot of studies done on this, like if you are explicitly inviting people to speak up, if you thank people after they speak up, people really feel like that you're invested in their speaking up, and that really raises their ability to speak up around you. So that's a very important thing. And what you say really matters. So there was a study done with medical students in a simulated case where the simulated surgeon either told them, listen, we're going to do this case, and I don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time. And then they would go do the case. Or the surgeon said, we're going to do this case, and your opinion really matters. If you want to say something, just say it. Okay? So both surgeons, the simulated surgeon, made an error in process of steps that was made obvious to the medical student. When the surgeon said, we don't have a lot of time, only 30% of the medical students spoke up. When the surgeon said, your opinion matters, over 80% of the medical students spoke up. The medical students speaking up to the surgeon. So what you say in inviting people at the beginning really, really matters for them. And that really is hugely helpful for patient safety. And so again, it doesn't matter what you think you're like, it matters what other people see you as. So if you think that you're such a generous and inviting person, but actually you're not realizing that your facial expressions are quite harsh when somebody is speaking up to you, that's a thing to sort of check yourself and understand what people think of you as well. And so again, if people are speaking up to us, and this is the nonverbal message that we're sending, then this can really discourage people from sharing their views. And this is not to say that you have intentionally thought, boy, the team isn't valuable. I don't care what that person has to say. This usually comes from us thinking we're right? This usually comes from, a place where we think we have the answer and we're going forward. And if somebody's speaking up to us, we sort of want to know where they're coming from, but we still may think we're right. So we have to make sure that we're not giving these messages as well, and instead inviting people in and allowing ourselves to listen to their concerns as well. And so just to summarize, that, we have a lot of hurdles. They're gonna be there. People are still people. But what we need to do is really to overcome the hurdles, both by using these types of language patterns, checking our nonverbal skills, or our nonverbal communication, listening to our stories that we're telling ourselves and examining them, using these I saw, I think, I wonder things to get people talking, to come to a better understanding. That will help us overall. And things that you can do to practice is just to start engaging in a little perspective taking during the day, thinking about, is this the only thing I can be telling myself this story, and how must they see it from their point of view? It doesn't necessarily stop you from making those snap judgments. You still might make snap judgments, but it helps you to be quicker to rescue yourself when you're telling yourself those stories when you see something that doesn't make sense to you. Also things like starting to use the basic assumption. I can just tell you from a personal experience, when the basic assumption entered my life and I started thinking that of other people, it completely changed my life, the way I interact with people, the way I see other people, the way I see other members of the team. And so I really feel like that being a mantra is a really wonderful thing. And then the 3 R's to consider that if that's something that you think would be helpful. So with that, I know I'm a couple minutes early. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
For questions.
No, thank you. This is really wonderful, and I think is directly applicable to all of us that are leading education teams. And I wanted to just ask one or two questions to start, and then in just a minute we will be unmuting the lines and inviting questions on the Vance line. We will also be taking questions from the Microsoft link. If you want to type your questions in, we'll be answering them that way as well. So I wanted to just ask for you to just reiterate to us the basic assumption and how you would apply that in an educational setting. I mean, I really like the example you gave of the surgeon and the medical students, but I'd like to sort of push you on it a little bit. So, okay, so let's say I'm either, the attending on a ward team or I'm the attending in a clinic. How do I operationalize that? do I sort of say this? I mean, what if I am actually really, busy? How do you do it?
Yeah. So if you're talking specifically about the basic assumption, so I find in talking to people who are sort of, so you yourself are quite an advanced educator, and you are invested in this. So I think of people, generally I think of people who are very, very invested in education. They may already be doing this in the back of their minds. But for people who may actually see learners, I mean, I've heard comments of people saying, well, we have to help our patients from the learners and those kinds of things. So if you're starting to see the learners as, they're making mistakes, they're lazy, they don't care, they're millennials, they don't have the same dedication that I do. I would challenge people, if those are the stories that you tell yourselves about your learners, that this might be a safer and more productive way to think about them, because I think all of those things, it just looks different. It's still there. People are still committed. It just looks a little different. And maybe they need support to come to where you are. And that's where this helps with the supportive aspect, because it sort of turns it into, then you've made an alliance with the learner, which is what you desperately need in any kind of learning environment. Does that kind of answer the question?
Absolutely. No, okay. I think that's very helpful. Now, the other question that I wanted to ask about relates to the reptilian brain. As a cognitive behavioral neurologist, I love that that you brought up the reptilian brain, because, of course, I agree with you 100%. So you have helped to raise our consciousness that all of us may be inadvertently doing this, and you have urged us to try to resist it. But you have not, I don't think, told us exactly how we do that. How do you control the reptilian brain and have it not make all those faces when your team member does X, Y, or Z?
Yeah. So I mean, so I think. So I agree with you. It's really, really hard. And I think there are a couple of techniques that I've read about. You probably know much more than I do. So I'm treading into thin waters here with you, I know. But basically what I kind of understand by what I've read is things that you can do to be more mindful and to separate your emotions, things like attentional labeling, which is basically to say to myself, if I see something, and say I see a learner about to do something that looks dangerous to me, and I sort of step in the way, and then we have a conversation later. If I just let myself feel all those emotions, like anger and frustration, maybe disgust, and don't call myself out on them, it doesn't give me any time to reflect on what exactly is going on for me. So just saying to myself, that I'm feeling awfully angry right now, I'm feeling awfully disgusted right now, it makes me not become the emotion, but it separates myself from the emotion a little bit. So I kind of do that a little bit. I didn't talk about this.
So to be mindful of your own emotions, so that you can, as one of our participants said, to use your cerebral cortex to try to control it.
Yeah. And just to gain a little control, just like you said. Yeah. Because your emotions are telling you very important things, right? And not to totally try to suppress them, because they'll leak out anyway, and it doesn't work. Other people, they have autonomic responses to us if we're trying to suppress, and so that's not good. But just to try to gain control of them and not become the emotion, but to separate it a little bit. Is that?
Yes.
Did I do okay?
Great. Okay. Well, let's open it up to some questions from our room here at VA Boston, as well as Microsoft Link, and I'm going to unmute the Vance lines. Question from, please. Do we have a question from the Vance? And again, if you're not asking a question, please do mute your lines.
Hi, this is Marianne Antonelli. I'm calling in from Honolulu. You mentioned identifying your own emotions. Does it at all help in these circumstances? As in that very last one, let's say, excuse me.
I thought I was doing I can do whatever you guys want.
Yeah. So I'll just remind those. Please mute your line. It does seem like we have an open mic. And Marianne in Honolulu, please just shout your question one last time.
Okay, so my question is, in the circumstance that you just discussed about reacting to a student doing something that might be dangerous at the time, that you need to react to and quickly, does it help to identify that emotion, not just to yourself, but to the student?
Oh, I would say...
Saying, this is very upsetting, and therefore I need to take this command right now, but let's discuss it later.
I think that's brilliant, because what it does, as long as you're not, again, becoming the emotion and screaming or growling or pushing or something like that, but instead saying, it has to be a little tempered, because whatever emotion you share, they will react to, obviously. But indicating the importance of the situation, the dangerousness of what's going to happen, is an incredibly powerful teaching tool too, because you want them to recognize and you need them to be a little emotionally activated, to remember and to imprint on their mind. So I think that's actually, you could say, if you think that they're not going to be then derailed, if you say, I am furious, for example, that might not get you to a point where they can recover in order to take the next steps. But if you say, this seems really unsafe, we'll talk about it, I'm feeling a little frustrated right now. I guess it depends on the learner too. So I don't have good data on that, but I think not trying to hide it entirely doesn't help either. So does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's a good try. Probably something we can think about how to say it.
Yes.
Maybe not the furious one, but
yes.
This is very concerning. I'm worried about this patient, so let's do it this way, and then we'll discuss the other options.
Yes. And then maybe afterwards you can let them know how your emotions work, because maybe in the moment it might derail them a little bit. Yes. Sorry.
I feel so
All right, thank you.
intimidated to speak up right now. What do you think the biggest impact, I don't know if you presented this data in terms of creating a culture that promotes this type of communication, is it in the educator or in the student, or is it a combination of both? Because if you have an educator that's a bullying kind of educator, and the student is very timid,
right,
that's a horrible situation.
I think the impacts of the leadership is incredibly wide. I mean, that's where I think the impacts are really most felt by the whole group. I mean, it's if your leader, so if just the students are being taught this and the leaders don't buy into it, that's the fastest way that people will totally abandon all of these things, because they'll see that actually it's not true, that people don't hold the basic assumption of them, that people don't invite people to speak up and that kind of stuff. They don't feel valued. So I think that we really have to believe it at a leadership level and walk the walk as we talk the talk, and not just try to teach the students this. So I agree with you. Yeah, leadership is where it's at.
And we got a similar question written in of how can a facility, let's say, implement these speaking up conversations as a strategy to improve communication among staff, clinicians, and veterans or patients.
Yeah.
That how can, thinking at a macro level, how can this be implemented?
Yeah. I feel like if the leadership buys into something like this, I think this is a behavior thing. This goes to how people see themselves and how they see other people. So this goes at very deep identity levels that people have to sort of grapple with and reflect on. And so I think that not only people spending some time thinking about and reflecting on how they see the other members of their team, how they value the other members of the team, what might be they thinking, if somebody does speak up to them, how do they really feel about that? And then actually practicing the language, practicing the conversations, inviting it from each other. It has to take a full commitment with a lot of people. And if there are outliers, I think having some way for the outliers to be kind of called out on it, that it can't be okay, that the group has decided, the group is committed to this is okay. If I start to use my observations and my concerns with asking you a question, then if somebody else hears it, they should also feel free to help me get the conversation going as well. So if we all have a commitment to it, then, but it's a big undertaking. So yeah.
And I would just comment that I do think it is important for organizations, even outside of education, to really have this attitude. And I do think for VA medical centers, it comes down from the top, from the medical center director and from the chief of staff. Other questions from the Vance line or from the room?
The pigtail need.
Anyone on the pigtail with a question? Well, I want to thank you so much, Rebecca. This has just been a wonderful talk. I think something that is completely relevant to all of us in education and really completely relevant to all of us in healthcare or any organization. So thank you very much for joining with us today.
Next month.
That's my honor.
And just talking about next month, we have November 3rd at noon Eastern Time is our next presentation. We'll be talking about interprofessional education and healthcare and strategies to increase